and welcome to Arlington Public News' presentation of this debate on a ballot question that has generated a lot of conversation in Arlington. It is ballot question number 5, which concerns the adoption of the Community Preservation Act in Arlington. I'm going to go over the format of the debate initially before I introduce our two guests and we get going. The debate is a 1-hour recorded live-to-tape event, and that means that there will be no edits once we begin. There was no pre-screening of the questions that will be asked, and the way that we will proceed is that there will be a 1-minute opening statement from each of our two guests, followed by a series of 10 questions that I will ask, picking them at random from out of this bowl. And then our guests will have an opportunity to give each other 2 questions each. The answers in each round of the questioning, the answers will be limited to 2 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for a rebuttal from the other side that will last for 1 minute. A coin toss was used to determine the order, and we will now welcome our guests. For speaking on behalf of those who urge adoption of ballot question 5 and the CPA is Joe Curo. And to my right is Michael Ruderman, who will be arguing, or debating, I should say, excuse me, for the opposition. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
So without further ado, we're going to move to opening statements, and Mr. Curo will go first.
Thank you, James. On November 4th, Arlington voters will decide whether to join 155 other Massachusetts cities and towns in adopting the Community Preservation Act. By voting yes on question 5, we accept our role as stewards of the rich legacy bequeathed to us by past generations. How many times have we discussed the state of our senior center? How long have we tried to boost tourism to our town, only to find our history buried by years of neglect to special places like our town symbol of an Otoby hunter, or the old burying ground where patriots of the Revolutionary War have found their resting place? How often has town meeting gone on record supporting the protection of the Mulgar property and flood-stricken East Arlington homeowners? How much have we struggled to meet residents' needs for affordable housing on our own terms rather than those of the state? The Community Preservation Act gives us the tools to do something constructive in response to these questions, and I look forward to discussing it this evening.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruderman.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Joe, and to ACMi. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's hard to argue with something that involves community and preservation in its title. It sounds like you're arguing against everything that's good and right about what government can do. But this evening I'm going to ask you to vote no on question 5, and I'm going to ask you to vote no because the CPA is a law that addresses problems from a different era politically, and certainly a different financial market. The problems that it seeks to solve are not the present problems that Arlington faces, either with its cultural resources or affordable housing assets, or the amount of commitment that we are giving to preserving those very same qualities. It's a solution in search of a problem, a very expensive one, and I hope that tonight I'll give you very prudent reasons why Arlington should not adopt the CPA.
Thank you both very much, and we will proceed right to the questions, and I will begin with you, Mr. Curo, and I will just remind our audience and you guys as well that you have 2 minutes to answer each question, and then followed by a 1-minute rebuttal opportunity. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm going to start with Mr. Ruderman first.
Oh, okay.
Excuse that faux pas. So, Mr. Ruderman, revenues raised by towns that have adopted the Community Preservation Act are currently matched by the state under the State Community Preservation Act Trust Fund. Future state matches are not guaranteed, however. Is this a significant factor for taxpayers to take into account when they vote on November 4th?
The state has promised to match what towns tax themselves to put into their own budget for community preservation projects. The state has a long history, sadly, of not being good on its promises, whether you look at state aid over the last 2 decades, shifting the costs of encouraging our uniformed police personnel to seek higher education under the Quinn Bill and to gain salary through that, even down to the level of taking back money that had been promised to towns to be able to send their children to the regional school and the bus contracts. All of those are instances where the state has promised great things and then fallen back more and more each year. Now, the charges that the state puts into the trust fund come from surcharges at the registries of deeds. But when the CPA was first enacted, business was booming, the real estate market was white hot, and revenue was way beyond what towns who adopted the CPA could withdraw. Since then, the real estate market has cooled significantly. In some places, it's flattened. And the revenues that the registries of deeds have been charging on top of the normal document fees, well, they've come down a corresponding amount. The first towns that bought into the CPA had their own tax contributions matched 100%, and then 70%, and then the 60s and the 50s. The present estimate today is somewhere in the 20s. We'll know better at the end of this month. But unless the legislature decides to take more money out of the rainy day fund and put it into the CPA trust fund, the allotment is only going to be 23, 24%, something like that. It's not a good deal.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kiro.
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting that we say only 23% or such, because I'm not aware of any other situation where we can actually get that type of return on our money right up front. It is very true that the trust fund distributions have gone down over the years. I mean, there's not much that is the same as it once was. I'll say today is my birthday, so that's very close to me right now. I'm not the same as I was at one time. But just last week, I met with a number of our legislators. I often attend the Massachusetts Municipal Association's legislative breakfasts, where leaders from various cities and towns will raise particular concerns, and this was front and center. And I asked the question straight on to some of the legislators in attendance. They're very aware of this problem with the decline in fees. That's why the state did kick in a portion of the surplus last year. They've committed to do so if there's a surplus this year, and they're committed to try to fix the problem going forward.
Thanks very much. Next question goes to you, Mr. Kiro. If the CPA is passed, will there be any discretion for funds collected for the CPA to supplement or be transferred to other capital budgets or investments? Or in other words, are the funds locked, or will any flexibility exist to help Arlington address other fiscal needs? Thank
you very much, James. That's actually precisely why one of the benefits of the CPA for Arlington, I believe. You may know that in my other hat, I'm a member of the Arlington Board of Selectmen, and this was actually some of the reasoning in putting this before town meeting. We have quite a number of items within our current capital budgets that could potentially be CPA eligible. The town manager estimated that we could potentially apply up to $8 million going forward. Now, those numbers are subject to some debate, but we do have a number of historic properties within the capital fund. I'll give you one example that we could have used had we been in the CPA already. The Central Fire Station, a historic building, $6 million project. Even if, let's say, the state fund match were dropped to 25%, we're still talking $1.5 million potentially that we could have had come into the town of Arlington to assist us in that project. If we look carefully and coordinate with the capital plan, there is a potential to take projects that are already in our 5-year capital plan looking out in the future and fund them partly through CPA funds. This isn't unusual. Not everything in the capital plan comes directly out of the general fund or directly from bonding. There was $3 million last year in the capital fund that came from other sources. Other sources include federal and state grants. They include other programs. CPA would, I believe, fall under that. Lastly, one of the recommendations that I've supported and a lot of others have supported is making sure that the Community Preservation Committee that would be charged with looking at priorities included a member of the capital planning committee to make sure there was coordination between the two.
Okay,
and integration.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Ruderman.
However you look at the line items on the budget, adopting the CPA and agreeing to tax yourself more money has to expand the town budget. That's the law. You can't simply take items that are in the town budget now and say, oh, charge that to the CPA and reduce the bottom line. You can't do that. You can devote CPA money to things that you're already thinking of doing in the future, but you can't take that line item out. It's written into the CPA legislation. CPA taxes can only supplement. They can't supplant. So by agreeing to raise your taxes under the provisions of the CPA, you are broadening the mission of the town. And however you move the money around in the budget, whether you say this project will be paid out of this pot or that out of this one, you're raising more money. You're increasing taxes. You're putting money aside for perhaps future things, but you are increasing the mission.
Okay, thank you very much. And coming right back to you, Mr. Ruderman, with this question. And it's a little long, so just bear with me. Among the exemptions to the proposed surcharge of 1.5% are that the first $100,000 of assessed value will be exempted for all properties, and that low-income homeowners and low and moderate-income seniors would be completely exempt. Do you agree that this surcharge effectively transfers the bulk of the cost of the CPA to middle-class taxpayers and others?
It certainly transfers the burden to people with higher property values. I know that there were some political reasons as well as you might say, the philosophical ones for creating these exemptions that towns may elect to incorporate into their own particular fashion of adopting the CPA. I know that the CPA was passed in the city of Fall River, which has had some very hard times for quite a while. I lived in New Bedford for a number of years, and New Bedford, Fall River, the South Coast cities struggle with a lot of issues. But Fall River passed the CPA and agreed to tax itself more. I think the $100,000 exemption, the first $100,000 on property, exempted about 50% of the tax base there as far as the number of households. So it was a considerably easier sell to get the city to vote for the CPA. Likewise, the exemption for seniors, it helps. It does say that we acknowledge you may have more limited resources, but it's a political flag to fly. Overall, it's still going to raise your tax rate. It's a 1.5% surcharge, as Arlington has elected to put forth on the ballot. And that 1.5% is a significant increase, as I see it, on what the town has the authority to raise each year. Under what we nicknamed Proposition 2.5, towns are limited to tax increases on the property tax to 2.5%, and that's it. Or they have to come to the voters and ask for something more. Arlington's real estate property tax goes up 2.5% every year reliably. And now they're asking us for 1.5% on top of 2.5%, another 60% of the allowable raise on an annual basis. Whether you exempt people or not, it's a tough amount to swallow.
Thank you. Mr. Kiro, rebuttal?
Yes, thank you. It's not a full 1.5%. Every single taxpayer gets a $100,000 automatic exemption. That's important to recognize. That's for all residential property. That's for all commercial property. Everyone. Secondly, as far as senior exemptions, they're actually broader than what you will find on the general tax rate. Anybody who makes is in the moderate income range, moderate to low income, who's 60 years of age or older would be fully exempt. Anyone who's low income would be fully exempt from taxes. So the exemptions are much broader. It's a much more progressive taxing structure than most of the property tax as it exists currently. And I think that that's one of the big benefits to this, in addition to state matches and the other benefits we've already discussed.
Okay, thanks. And question number 4 comes to you, Mr. Kiro, first. The wording of question 5 states that, and I quote, "Upon acceptance of the CPA by the voters, a community preservation committee, as you alluded to before, must be established by bylaws to study community preservation needs, possibilities, and resources." So the questions are these. Will this new committee represent the interests of all Arlington residents, or do you believe, as some critics contend, that it will become a special interest dominated committee? And secondarily, how are members of the committee selected, and will there be term limits?
Thank you for the question. You've got a few pieces there. The Community Preservation Committee is a part of the statute that created the Community Preservation Act. It specifies that any community adopting the act must create a committee of up to 9 members with a minimum of 5. There are 5 positions that are set aside very specifically for the Conservation Commission, for the Parks and Recreation Commission, for the Planning Board, which in Arlington is the Redevelopment Board, for the Housing Authority, and for the Historical Commission. So those stakeholders are at the table. The other 4, assuming that we go to the full 9, and I would advocate for that, and I think most people would with a community our size, would be specified by town meeting. Town meeting has a number of options. They can make the Community Preservation Committee an elected body if they want. It could go to the voters for the additional 4 spots. They can make it an appointed body. It will be complete, like so much of this act, so much of the final control is within town meeting's purview. I've already stated earlier in the debate that I believe that it makes sense for us to include capital planning and or finance committee representation to help integrate with our long-range plans and our budgets. But again, the final word on that would be the finance committee's, the town meeting's decision.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Ruderman?
Everything that Joe has said is true, but I ask you to think about what's not represented on the Community Preservation Committee. This act by law can only fund certain purposes. No one will sit on the Community Preservation Committee and say, you know, I'm really afraid that the next time we have a heavy storm or a hurricane that East Arlington is going to flood again. There'll be no one sitting on that committee that says, you know, we haven't even reached half of our obligation to put money into the accounts for the pensions of our town employees. Not even half. We are deficient in that. We have barely scratched the surface of putting money into the health expense account for our town employees who are retired. I believe that number is about 4%, only 4% of our obligation. They won't have a chair at the table.
Okay, thanks for that. Moving on, the Community Preservation Coalition calls the 1.5% tax levy a surcharge instead of a tax. Do you think that there is a difference in that to the taxpayers?
Only politically. Whether you call it a tax or a surcharge, it's money out of your pocket. It's money out of your escrow account if the bank that holds your mortgage is collecting additional money to pay your real estate taxes. If blessed luck to you, you've paid off your house and you're free and clear, you're going to write that number on a check. The State Department of Revenue has defined it as a tax. As far as what you can call a tax on your tax returns, it's a tax. Call it a surcharge. Politically, there may be a difference. It's money out of the taxpayer's pocket that goes to the town for a very special set of purposes, which may not be the most pressing needs that Arlington is facing this year or in budget years to come. Now, whether or not you call it a tax or a surcharge, look at the purposes that it will fund and think about the money that we're already putting into those. Our capital planning budget, or grants that are administered by the Board of Selectmen, the federal program called the Community Development Block Grant, we're already putting substantial amounts of money as a town into preserving the historical assets that we own, into keeping people in their homes if they need housing assistance, into maintaining the parks and playgrounds, the open spaces that we already own. There are many line items in the budget every year that already represent Arlington's commitment to funding these needs on an ongoing, regular, predictable basis. The CPA simply says, no, we want more money here. Why? Well, we need it. Why? Because we say so? We're meeting our obligations. No, we are exceeding our obligations in many parts of the budget in all of these categories.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll.
Thank you very much. I'm going to actually try to answer the question, which was whether it's a tax or surcharge. Is there a difference and does it matter? It does increase the tax bill. There's no dispute about that. I think it's a technicality when we call it a surcharge, and I think the technical difference is the way it's computed. So it's computed based on the amount of tax on the bill minus exemptions, et cetera, et cetera. One way, however, in which it differs from the rest of your property tax bill is that the CPA surcharge is actually broken out separately. So from the revenue side, it's actually much more transparent than any other part of the property tax bill. We strive hard in this town to be transparent. We have the Arlington Visual Budget. Anybody can go online. We're rolling out open checkbook. But this is one place where every single taxpayer will see it broken out. The other way it differs is that after 5 years, if folks are unhappy, we can remove it by ballot vote, just as we're doing this November.
All right, thank you very much. And right back to you, Mr. Curo. What's the real cost to taxpayers of the Community Preservation Act, or excuse me, if the CPA is approved? Proponents estimate that cost at under $100 a year for most homeowners, while opponents assert that it is closer to, in the aggregate, in total, $1,300,000 per year. Where do you come down on that?
First, I just want to encourage everyone to go to www.arlingtoncpa.org and take a look. There's a link on the right-hand side. There is a calculator there where you can go in and you can enter your own situation. Whether you have anyone in your home who's 6 years of age or over, what your income is, what your assessed value of your home is. You can calculate it right there, and you'll see for yourself what the impact, based on this year's assessed values and based on this year's tax rate, you'll see right there what your situation is. And that, I think, is important for people as they're making up their minds about this. Yeah, I understand that the $1.3 million has been put out, but that's actually not taking into account any exemptions whatsoever. Our best guess is that we're probably looking at around $1.1 million in revenue coming in to the town on this basis, and that's making reasonable assumptions for people taking advantage of the exemptions or whatnot. But as far as people's individual situations, they should take a look, and you're correct. You actually said $100. Based on the average valuation right now and the current tax rate, it's about $86 is what it works out to.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Ruderman.
Sure. In a previous lifetime, I was a history teacher, and one question that comes up all the time when you're talking about economics or money is, well, what's that in today's dollars? And one way that works very well in historical discussions is to say, all right, what else could it buy? So I ask you to look at the overall amount to be raised by the CPA tax, if we vote for it, and ask yourself, what else could it buy? There's a measure of value. Our estimate on our website, votenocpatax.org, gives a number of examples. On an annual basis, the money raised could pay for, I think, about 21 full-time teachers, 22 or 23 full-time fire or police officers, about the same number of maintenance workers or town engineers. That's what it costs.
Okay, thanks very much. Moving on. This is another question which I'll be quoting from the wording of Q5 itself. And it says, at least 10% of the funds for each fiscal year will be spent or reserved for later spending on each of the Act's 3 community preservation purposes, those being, as you all have explained, number 1, open space such as parks and playgrounds, number 2, historic resources, and number 3, community housing in the town of Arlington. So the questions are, what happens to the funds that are not spent? Who gets to decide what projects the funds will be reserved for? And do you think that this situation suits the best interests of Arlington residents?
Sure. We don't know exactly because we haven't seen how this would work in Arlington yet. And as Joe mentioned, it's up to every town's legislative body to craft its own bylaw to decide how the Community Preservation Committee will be formed, how they will generate projects, and how they'll present them to town meeting. What seems to be the course in other towns is that they come to town meeting with a slate of projects that satisfy all of their spending. Now, if you think about that, it's kind of a backwards arrangement, isn't it? They start out with a pile of money and say, all right, we have to spend this, so let's find things to do. Everything else in the town budget begins with we have needs, either present, immediate, got to do them today, got to do them this year needs, got to do them in the next year or 2 or 3 or 5, got to put some money away for the long term. But we start with the need, and then we look and see what's it going to cost? How can we get a good deal? Is it people that we're hiring? Is it materials that we're purchasing? Is it contracts? Is it thinking smarter than we've thought before to come up with a better price? We start with the needs, and then we think, what money can we apply? Community Preservation Act makes it backwards. It says, we will devote this much money in these 3 categories and everything else left over, and now we've got to find things to spend it on. And I have no doubt that there will be a full list of projects that come forward. And I'm sure that the Community Preservation Committee, if we vote yes on 5, will come with a list of projects that will spend every dollar. I don't know if they'll be the best ones for the money. I don't know if they will satisfy our long-term needs. We'll just have to find out. We don't know.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Carroll.
With all due respect, I've been around budgeting for quite many years now, both on the school committee and the Board of Selectmen, and as a member of the Long Range Planning Committee. This is from just yesterday's meeting. We start with numbers first. We've been working off of a multi-year financial plan now since 2005, which is formula-driven. We have an idea of how much revenue we have, what the growth factors will be for the revenue. Budgets are developed to the number. Every year the school committee gets a number and develops budgets, knocks things out, puts things in based on the number, with all due respect. As far as what happens to funds that are not spent, they can be rolled over to future projects. Community preservation funds can also be used towards bonded projects to pay debt service for a larger project over a number of years when there are not enough funds. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cura, what specific projects would the CPA help fund? What criteria would be used to prioritize projects, and how would the process be open and fair to the interests of Arlington residents?
Well, the specific projects that would be funded, that would be a decision of town meeting. Pure and simple, a decision of town meeting. The recommendations would be brought forth by the Community Preservation Committee. I think we've stated several times, I would hope that they would coordinate very closely with the Finance Committee, with the Capital Planning Committee and other stakeholders within town. I think that for myself, and this is for myself, I think that the criteria should really look first at those needs that have been deferred year after year after year here. For example, there's been a lot of chatter on the Arlington list, and there was a note that went out today talking about the Robbins Farm Park. Robbins Farm Park had a phase 2 to deal with the basketball courts, the baseball fields, the upper field. It was put into the capital plan, which is the forward-looking document, in 2004. It's been pushed off. It's been pushed off. We're now looking at 2016. That's 12 years. That's like a whole generation of kids that project has been pushed off for. So I personally would like to see projects that have been deferred so long. Another area that I hear a lot about walking around town is the senior center. Our senior center is currently housed in an historic building, the old Central School building, it is possible to do adaptive reuse under the Community Preservation Committee. I would hope that we could get the discussion started around fixing that senior center, under Community Preservation Act. But again, these will be recommendations brought forward by the Community Preservation Committee, acted on by town meeting. But for myself, those are a couple that I would like to see looked at, projects that have been long deferred, and that would be one of them, would be this senior center.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ruderman.
It's been nebulous what specific projects CPA money would be spent on. I think we're hearing the first specifics tonight as far as actually identifying a particular need. It's interesting, though, that these very same projects that Joe just mentioned are in for some significant improvements in this year's budget. In this year's capital plan, we've already committed to spending $506,000, more than $500,000 on Robbins Farm Field and Playgrounds. That's in the budget for this year. Right now, we've already approved that. The Central School, where the senior center is located, $250,000, $250,000 for that historic asset that serves so many town functions, including the senior center. It's in our budget. We are more than meeting our needs and looking at our priorities here.
Okay, thanks very much. And moving on to the last two questions in this round. This one goes to you, Mr. Ruderman. Since 2000, Arlington's tax growth has exceeded inflation, in large part due to taxpayers supporting 2 overrides. Can Arlington afford this new surcharge in view of large capital projects such as the rebuild of the Arlington High School, those kinds of projects that are anticipated?
I know that's the, I don't even know what number to put on that question. Maybe the $200 million question when we look at the town budget plus school projects. That's just a guess, but it's an enormous sum of money. The one that frightens me, though, here are 2 numbers that frighten me. 2020 and 14 million. 2020 is the end year for the projections that the Long-Range Planning Committee is looking at. And I believe the information that they were looking at just last night was that by the year 2020, not that far away, especially if you've got kids in the school system, you can look at them and say, okay, class of 19, class of 20, there they are. There's the future. 2020 is coming up fast. We will be $14 million in debt. That's the way the town budget is headed. The tax revenue, the 2.5% that we're allowed to add on to it every year before asking the voters for more, plus what we hope and pray will be the usual appreciation in the property values all over town, plus the voters' ability to come up with more money for the special projects, things that need to be bonded, things that need to be paid out over numerous years. Take all those projections and the best numbers that you saw last night. In 2020, we are $14 million in the red. There's no way to pay for that yet. There are proposals, but there's no way to pay for that yet. Financially, we're going to the voters and we're saying, would you like to pay another 1.5% with some exemptions, another 1.5% on top of the 2.5% that we are allowed to raise your taxes, knowing full well that in just a few years, we are seriously in arrears? That's a question. I ask the voters to consider that.
Thank you. Mr. Curo.
Thank you. Well, in fact, those were not the best numbers we saw. We actually are looking at a number of different scenarios right now, and that's what we do in this town. We work collaboratively to test our assumptions, and we looked at about 7 scenarios or 8 scenarios, which wildly vary. But on the high school, I would just refer you to the capital planning report, which actually has laid out a plan to approach the high school project with no net increase in exempt spending, because we're paying off all of the current and previous school rebuild efforts. As those those costs get rolled off, it creates what the committee has called implied debt capacity. We still have to go back to the voters, but I think some of the sky is falling kind of prognostications that have been put out there really don't hold water, there will be that test. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. And finally, for this round, the Finance Committee opposed the adoption of the Community Preservation Act at town meeting. Are you familiar with their reasoning for that, and were they justified in your opinion?
Thank you. Well, that's kind of a funny question to put to me, because as a member of the Board of Selectmen, which did vote 4-1 to put it before town meeting and before the voters, obviously I disagreed with the Finance Committee's advisory position on that. I understand the concerns that have been raised. In my judgment, what the Finance Committee put out there was really they were making a judgment about the tolerance of the voters for this proposal, but that's not a financial judgment. One could only even say that that's a political judgment. I don't know. Maybe it's because of my experience. Since 2008, I've actually personally faced the voters in town 3 times and talked to hundreds of people, and I have a little bit, maybe I'd say I have a little bit more faith in them to not artificially conflate the 2 issues. Look at the CPA. Are these priorities? Are they not? If they aren't, vote it down. But if you agree with me and with others who have been, several hundred people who have signed on as supporters for this, and many town committees and private non-profit organizations in town, judge it on its own merits. Don't artificially conflate the 2. So no, I don't agree with the recommendation, but I do respect the work that the Finance Committee does in so many ways.
Thank you for that considered answer. And Mr. Ruderman.
If I can take a moment to go back to the previous question, the term implied debt capacity was used. What's that in real speak, in real language? Implied debt capacity is we're socking it to the voters now for borrowing that never seems to end, but we did promise them it'll end. Someday we'll pay off.
Yes, I think, can you focus on this question right now, please?
Sure. FinCom voted against adopting the CPA. The Vote No CPA group has supporters, the treasurer, the vice chair of capital planning. It's as if the people who have to cut budgets and make the budgets work think it's a bad idea. The people who get to cut ribbons thought it was a good idea.
Okay. Thank you very much, and that closes out this round of questioning. You now will have an opportunity to pose questions to each other, 2 each. Answers will be limited to 2 minutes, and then the asker of the question will have a minute to rebut. We'll begin with you, Mr. Ruderman.
Whenever...
Okay, I'm sorry, I got it wrong again, apparently, from what I just heard. Excuse me. Mr. Curo, you will begin.
Okay.
Excuse me for that again.
Okay. Michael, you mentioned that town meeting has repeatedly endorsed funding for affordable housing through the community development block grants, as well as capital spending for parks and playgrounds and historic structures. And you and I have served together for many years there, so we know that this is true. And yet during the course of this campaign, we've heard that such projects are referred to repeatedly as special interests. So how is it that the No campaign sees this as special interests when it's within the context of the CPA, but not when it's within the context of town meeting actually voting for them?
Sure. Every budget is a long set of choices. Somebody once told me in a governance class that your bylaws are your ethics and your budget is your choices. So in the process of putting together a budget, we, the town, have decided certain things are important and worthy and need our support, literally our tax support. And along with making sure that the roads are maintained and passable and clearing them of snow when it snows, along with making sure that we have a police force that can respond to our needs and a fire department that can protect us, we have decided as a town that we need to help people who may not be able to continue to afford their home in Arlington to live here, or give them assistance in fixing up the home that they're living in, sometimes providing a place to live, or renovation assistance. We've decided that if we own a historical asset, it's our responsibility to maintain it and transmit it to the next generation. We've decided that our parks and our open space are valued, and we've put dollar values on that. And the dollar values that we've put on these various categories compete with all the other needs in the budget. And the budget process decides this much now, this much later, this much we'll have to wait and see. Along comes the Community Preservation Act and says, yes, we know we have all these different needs competing in the budget, but we want more. We don't think you're doing enough. We don't have a specific amount that we need to do, but we think we need more. What do we need more in? We need more in our projects. We don't need more in teacher salaries. We need more in buying houses for affordable housing that we're already supporting. That's why I call it a special interest.
Thank you. Rebuttal.
Yeah, my rebuttal is, I mean, you've used the phrase several times now, we've decided. That's what this is all about, is about choice, it's about decision. First of all, the voters decide whether they want to participate in this program or not. As the voters in 155 other communities have decided, 8 communities will be deciding this on November 4th as well. So this is not something that's way outside the bounds of the ordinary. Secondly, the ultimate decisions on spending still are within town meetings' purview. So just as town meeting has endorsed the capital budgets year after year for many of these programmatic areas, just as town meeting has endorsed the community development block grant applications, town meeting would be charged with the final decision-making authority over any of the CPC recommendations as well. Okay.
Mr. Rudeman, your opportunity to ask a question.
One of the most illuminating questions that we hear asked every year is quoted by the head of our finance committee, Al Tosti, who I should say is one of the best assets that any town could have in putting together a budget. He asks, or he says, the selectmen ask me, what keeps you awake at night? What's your biggest fear? And so I ask you, what in Arlington's budgetary future keeps you awake at night, and what does the CPA do about it?
What the CPA does about it is the fact that we can take CPA funds with a state match, even if that match were 25%, even if that match were 20%, it allows us to leverage the funds that are raised here, move it back into compatible and eligible projects within the capital plan, potentially freeing up that portion of the plan to plow back into the stability reserve. It is possible, it is feasible, it's been mapped out. That's what keeps me up at night, is how some of the issues that I think we agree on a lot of this. When we look out at the future, you're right, the operating future is tough when we get to 2019, 2020. This is a way to bring more funds into Arlington, and that's what keeps me up at night.
It sounds to me from that answer that moving things off our normal budgeting process where all the interests compete and saying, oh, let's bring in this special funding source. It's a game of matching revenue to costs, and then we'll take the extra and we'll put it into a reserve fund against future debts. That sounds like you're asking for a tax override right now to extend Arlington's budget worthiness and maintain its credit rating. I think if the proponents came to the town and said, look, we need a tax override. We can't afford all the things that we've already told you we need. I think it would be a different debate. But no, we're being asked to look at some things that we're meeting the obligations for, and yet we can pull more money in and just save it for the future. That's not being square with the voters.
Thank you very much. Your turn, Mr. Curo. Last question for you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Michael, we all know that there's been pressure on the state match and that it's not what it once was. So for argument's sake, let's say it would drop to 20%. Mm-hmm. So that's 20 cents on the dollar. It's still real money. So why would you turn down the opportunity to bring additional state funds into Arlington?
As I've tried to teach my daughter, every time an ad comes on TV that says, the more you spend, the more you save. Well, no. The more you spend, the more you spend. Even if you're being offered some sort of discount, even if, as you say, if you're only 20%. Well, the state's saying for the political pain that your elected officials will suffer to come to the voters and say, we need more money. We have to raise your taxes even more than what we told you last year we're going to raise them. For that political pain, you get a little bit of assistance, of cover. Look, the state's going to help out. Well, the state's only going to help out maybe $1.05. And you're asking the voters to contribute 60% more than the increase that Prop 2.5 would allow you to raise without asking the voters for additional approval. That's a huge extension of the budgeting authority that the selectmen have. It's not about the individual dollars out of one person's pocket. It's about what happens town-wide, all of those contributions put together. You are significantly asking, you are asking for a significant increase in the ability of the taxpayers of Arlington to keep on increasing what they pay. And that's what we're opposed to.
Thank you. Rebuttal, sir.
Well, first of all, again, I would just say www.arlingtoncpa.org. Take a look at the calculator. Everybody can make a decision on their own as to whether it's a significant increase or not. I don't know where you're getting, $1.05, but it seems to me that we have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the funds that the voters do get, the taxpayers do pay to the town for goods and services. It's not as if everything goes away. These are fixed assets. I mean, Community Preservation Act, by and large, supports fixed assets that all residents of the community enjoy and can use, and which help property values in the long run.
Thank you. And the last question of this debate is yours to ask, Mr.
Sure.
Ruderman.
Joe, it's the towns that got in on the CPA at the inception saw a much better deal. They had money to spend to counter what was then a white-hot real estate market that seemed to be snapping up every last piece of open land. Tear-downs of historic structures were rampant. Parks and playgrounds were under threat from budget shortfalls. That was the situation in 2000, or 2004, or 2010, or 2012. What makes this year different from all other years that you feel it's politically honest to come to Arlington and say, we need the money now?
Well, first of all, let's look at the history of this. This was a resident-initiated ballot question, but it does make sense, and it makes sense when we look at some of the items that I referenced, deferred items on the capital plan. I have to correct one answer. You said that $506,000 for Robbins Farm Park is in this year. It is not. It's in for 2016, which means it's not in the budget. Until it's in the budget, it's not in the budget. What makes this year different is that we recognize that there are needs out in the future, and to provide this choice to the voters, that this is the time to do it at this point, not sometime down the future when we're going to ask again. One thing, I recognize the potential issue of crowding out. It didn't come to pass next door in Lexington. Their Capital Expenditures Committee vigorously opposed the adoption of the Community Preservation Act in 2005 when the matching rates were actually better. 2011, they debated actually scaling back their program, and the committee came back to town meeting. They said, we were wrong. The crowding out did not happen as had been predicted. We were wrong. This has actually been a benefit to the town. This is the time to do it, because even though we recognize that 5 years in the future, we do have needs looming, it's better to ask now than to look at the future when those needs are more immediate. And at that point, I would say it would be a lot easier to conflate them at that point. And I'll just end on a final note. You know, the first time the Community Preservation Act came before us, I actually opposed it because we had an override that very year. We're talking about a 4 or 5 year horizon now. It's a much different situation.
Thank you. And rebuttals.
I remember that was 10 years ago, and I was in favor of it. I said that, look, we've got projects that we haven't been able to address, and it doesn't look like we're going to be addressing them anytime soon. At that point in time, the Thompson Elementary School rebuild was in progress, bureaucratically at least. My daughter went to the Thompson School from kindergarten to 6th grade. It didn't get rebuilt. They were talking about it when she entered. They were talking about it when she graduated. It didn't happen. 10 years ago was a very different circumstance. What we're looking at today, the way we protect our historical assets, both through bylaws and through tax contributions, the way we maintain our parks and playgrounds, never on anybody's totally satisfactory schedule, we're meeting our obligations and more.
Thank you very much, and thank you both. We want to thank very much Joe Curo and Michael Ruderman for coming in and giving us an enlightening view of all the different aspects of ballot question 5. Make sure you make your own voice count by voting on November 4th. And for Arlington Public News, I'm James Milan. Excuse me very much. I'm very sorry. I did not give you guys a chance to make your closing statements. I really blew that. I apologize. Mr. Curo, you have a minute to make a closing statement. I apologize.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to ACMi. You know, in an age when cities and towns bristle at unfunded mandates, the Community Preservation Act provides a rare opportunity. It is both funded and voluntary. Some would have you believe that we cannot use the Community Preservation Act and also support our schools. This is a false choice. If adopted, the Community Preservation Act will bring new state revenue to Arlington while retaining local control of spending. The decision on adoption rests with you, the voters. All decisions on use of community preservation funds would fall to town meeting. I would encourage you to read about the real benefits and costs to each Arlington taxpayer at www.arlingtoncpa.org. A vote for the Community Preservation Act gives Arlington 5 years to see just what it can do for our town. I hope you will join me on November 4th in voting yes on question 5. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ruderman, your closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you to ACMi, Joe. Appreciate this opportunity. Please have a look at our website, vote nocpatax.org. We have a number of arguments, a number of rationales, a number of equivalent expenditures that we feel the town ought to be looking at with its not limitless taxing authority that need attention now. I wish we were Lexington. I wish we had what seems like a limitless budget reserve. I wish we had the kind of population in town that can pay on average $282 per household just in the CPA tax. Lexington has bought some very pretty things. They've restored some very pretty buildings. And we're not Lexington. We have our own needs. And I think we do better by voting down the CPA.
Thank you very much. And with that, that concludes this debate on ballot question number 5. We thank Mr. Joe Curo and Mr. Michael Ruderman for being here today. And we urge you to go out on November 4th and vote, make your own voice count. For Arlington Public News, I'm James Milan. Thanks for joining us.